My sister Jenny and I were very, very close when we were younger. We were about 1.5 years apart. When we were going to elementary school, we would strap on our skates, and our dog Freckles, he was a big Dalmatian dog, big fat one. He would pull us on the sidewalks of the school, and that was one of my fondest memories of her. We were always together. We were very, very tight. When I was 11 and my sister was 9.5, my mom separated from my dad and we moved from California to Maryland. I was not getting along with my mom all that well. And so I moved back to California to live with my dad. My sister and I would keep in contact, phone calls and letters. That's when she met Michael. She was very young, she wasn't but 14 years old or so. The first time I met Michael, I have to say, there was something about him inside that I just didn't quite like, and I could never put my finger on it. He had an immaturity about him, being very boastful. When you meet these people that are just all into themselves, like they're the greatest person in the world and the entire world revolves around them, that was Michael. But I believe that he filled a hole in her life that she was really yearning for. She was in love with him and she appeared to be very happy. Jenny eloped with Michael when she was about 15, 16 years old. She had told me that she was pregnant, and my mom was definitely not happy with the situation, but she accepted the situation. And at that point, Jenny went to live with his parents down in Virginia. I met his dad a couple times. He was very gruff. He was a very stern father. And his mother, she was very dutiful, making sure that the dinner's on the table every night, making sure that everything's clean, the dishes are washed. Jenny seemed right at home. She built a life with him. They would go camping, they would go places together. They were a young couple, striking out against the world. And it at least appeared from the outside that they were a happy couple. About 10 years later, Melissa came along. And now with 2 children, the financial strain on the family, of course, it grows.
My mom worked a lot of odd jobs. She worked at a pizza place, she worked at a Mexican restaurant, and she ended up following in my grandmother's footsteps, and she worked in hospice care and took care of people.
She kept her nose to the grindstone. She worked on her schooling and she got her RN license. She was very much into the nursing field. Michael never held down a job for very long. Every time I talked to my sister, she was telling me that, oh yeah, Michael got fired from another job or he quit this job. And so my sister had to financially support the family, and it was a constant struggle for her.
She would also do as many odd jobs as she could. She would do people's taxes, and she sold Avon to try to keep money coming into the house. My father retired very young. He worked as a maintenance man at a popular hotel chain, and he said he dropped a bird bath on his foot. I never saw him limping or anything, but that's the reason he said he was retiring. After my father retired, he really became a recluse. He would just hide in his garage and just scroll eBay. He would buy all these collectible Tupperwares from the 70s. He would buy Beatles bobbleheads and records, and he would never listen to them. He would never use these things. He had multiple guitars and this giant firearm collection. He just wouldn't share a common space at all with anyone. He wouldn't even eat dinner at the same time as us. He would just look at eBay all day, all night. That's all he did.
He just spent. It was like he was just buying just to buy. I started to see that maybe it was because he needed control over it. As a child with his father, he was actually controlled. However, the spending was something where he was in control. He hadn't worked in years. He wasn't supporting the family like a mature man and husband should do. You take away the self-worth of a person, it's hard to be able to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. And I believe because of that controlling nature that was placed upon him, he ended up doing the same because that's what he felt comfortable with. That was his life. My husband and I decided that we'd had enough of California, and so we decided to move back to Maryland. And so my sister Jenny offered to go ahead and let us move in. In that month that I was there, I would hear the arguments. I would hear mainly Michael yelling at her, and my sister would be just trying to appease him. And I witnessed that on many, many occasions, pretty much almost on a nightly basis. Any respect that I really had for Michael dissipated very quickly at that point. I'll just be honest with you, I was thinking that Michael was a bum.
I never really saw the love between my parents. He didn't show her kindness or anything. He just continued to do nothing but abuse her. My father would do all of these disrespectful things. He would shove her against the wall or hip check her and call her the N-word. And he would belittle her any chance he got.
Her and I discussed the relationship just very briefly, but she really didn't want to talk about it. I knew my sister was in trouble, but I really didn't know how bad things were.
I was 4 years old. And I remember chaotic screaming. He took the back of my sister's neck and slammed her against the bed frame in our room. My mother was sitting on the stairs, holding my sister's head together. All I remember was her saying, "It's okay, honey, just stay calm, while we waited for the EMTs. I don't know if my mom didn't report him to the police because she was scared that we would end up on the street, or she really thought that all relationships were this way. My sister and I didn't know anything else, so of course we thought this sort of behavior was normal. When my sister turned 16, she got married and moved out. I feared my father. I remember I climbed onto the roof of our home because he was afraid of heights and I knew he wouldn't follow me. Little things would set him off. Would always tense up and you could never tell what he was thinking. And then he would just go for you. The first time my father threw me out of the house, I was 14 years old and it was snowing. It became a rather common occurrence for him to throw me out. It was always over something stupid. I would have to go find a couch or a friend to stay with. Really, around the age of 15 on, I was no longer in the home. I would always ask my mother, "Why do you let this happen to me?" And she would go, "Oh, honey, I can only control myself." We just lived in fear and just tiptoed and walked on eggshells, and he just did whatever he wanted.
Jenny would never really open up to me. She may have been embarrassed to say that, hey, you know, things aren't hunky-dory here in paradise anymore. I, to this day, do not really know exactly why she stayed with him. I believe that she didn't want to throw away what she had built with her family. My mom was living in Edgewater, Maryland. She had been in a car accident and she'd been having some really bad trouble with her ankle. And so my sister said, well, I'm going to go ahead and bring her to my home here in Virginia. She put her in a spare room that they had, but then they decided that they would do an addition onto the home with a living room and a room for my mom to live in, her own bathroom. My mom got right around $150,000 for the sale of her house, and $72,000 went into the remodel of the home. My mom would write me fairly often. She asked me point blank, why are they still charging me $2,500 a month to live here when I paid for doing this addition for my own room? At that point, I felt very helpless. This should not be. Why is she getting charged any money? You know, other than maybe food. And Jenny's reply back to me was that, I know, Susie, I know. I realized that she was completely powerless to do anything. I could tell she felt horrible about it, but she had no choice.
My father's spending was out of control. The money had to come from somewhere. I know they were refinancing multiple times as well, just to try to keep it going. My mom just didn't have a say in that house at all.
My mom was now being taken advantage of. My sister, by far, had been being taken advantage of. She needed to get away. My mom needed to get away, but there was no place for either of them to go. It's a horrible feeling knowing that somebody is in a situation that they can't get out of and you can't help them.
I told her, Mom, this isn't normal. Mom, he's abusing you, and I was giving her examples. And that's when she really kind of started to slowly think of the idea of trying to escape.
All of a sudden, out of the blue, get a phone call from Michael saying, yeah, Jenny left me. Do you know where she is? If I'd known what the end result would have been, I certainly would have done something.
The first time my mom thought about leaving was in 2014. She had realized that she was in a loveless marriage, and she had started to see how bad the abuse really was. One day she left work. She didn't tell him that she had put in her 2 weeks' notice, and she drove straight from her job to my house. And I was thrilled.
I had no idea she had even left him. But I received a phone call from Michael, and he was very, very upset. And he was imploring me if I knew where Jenny was. He was very emphatic. He wanted to know where she was. I immediately called my sister. She told me that he had taken a gun and he had pointed it to her head. And he had told her, "If you ever leave me, I will kill you."
That was the turning point.
When she told me that, I knew who he was. And I knew what situation she was in. And so I asked my sister, well, what about Mother? Because now my mom was still in the home with him and his mother, and Jenny's not there. And she replied, "I know." And still to this day, I feel a little bit guilty because I asked her, what about Mother? And I believe she felt a responsibility to our mom, and that's probably one of the main reasons why she went back.
My father was just calling and messaging and leaving all these voicemails. I think it was just so overwhelming.
You have 8 new messages.
That she decided to give it a try again. We walked on the beach, and she just cried, but she put on a brave face. And I still have that picture of her by the ocean, smiling, but there's a sadness, too. I knew she was afraid of what was going to happen when she got there.
She wasn't his wife. She was a possession. And he was not going to let anybody or anything take his possession away from him.
Soon after she got home, maybe a few days or a week, she called me and told me that things were better, things were doing good. He promised her that he would get a control on his spending. They came up with this idea that they were going to bring patients to the home, and then she wouldn't have to go somewhere to work anymore, and that she wouldn't have to work as hard.
Michael's father passed away, and now there was an empty room, and so they decided to go ahead and get a business license and open the home for elderly patients, receiving a monthly check for doing so. They called their home the Heflin Home, and it started with my mom and 2 others, and then when my mom passed away, then she was taking care of 3 elderly folks. In early 2016, my current husband and I took a trip out there for a couple days. I noticed that there were a bunch of cameras up around inside the home, and I asked my sister what they were for. And she had told me that if an elderly person fell, sometimes they might not even know how they fell. And so having a camera system was just good insurance. But they didn't have any downstairs, which is where her and Michael lived, because they never had any elderly down there.
There were 16 cameras around the house, but the 4 main ones pointed into the kitchen, the residential living room, outside, and the storage area that used to be the carport. And that was right outside of my father's garage. My mom's day would start very, very early, sometimes as early as like 4:30 in the morning.
She would start her mornings by getting everybody up, washing them, feeding them. She would take them to doctor's appointments, and she would care for them all the way through the day.
She didn't get very much time to herself at all.
When my sister had 3 residents in the home, she was pulling down about $11,000 a month. And the only expenses they had, of course, was the mortgage and utilities and food. But there was one person in the equation that was going to upset everything that she had worked for.
About 2 months in, he started spending again.
Brand new Bowflex machine, brand new exercise bike. There was all this ham radio equipment. I know that stuff's not cheap. And there was a tremendous gun collection. You can see where the money was being spent, and it wasn't on her.
All the promises that he had made, he went back on. My mom was exhausted from working all the time, and things were worse than ever.
There was one time that we were just walking around Winchester, and then my sister got a phone call, and it was Michael. And he was telling her, "You need to get home. You need to get home right away." We had only been gone for like 20, 30 minutes. And then she looked at me and she said, "I'm sorry, I have to go home." My sister was under his total control. When Jenny came to the realization that things were not going to get better, she decided she was going to leave Michael.
So one day she was delivering Avon, and I think she had let slip that things were not as it seemed at home. And this absolutely shocked her customer, and they really wanted to help her. So they put her in touch with a realtor out in California. She contacted this realtor. She told him what the situation was, that she was trying to get out, trying to escape. And the realtor said that he might have a room for rent in his own home. He was like, "I would love to have a feminine touch around here." He said that he was widowed. And it wasn't so much flirting, but it was a kindness that she really was not used to. So she had a place to go. She started packing. It's not like my father even noticed. He didn't notice. Half her clothes were packed up and mailed to my house.
She finally came to the realization that this is over.
I remember the day she was going to leave very clearly. I couldn't get a hold of my mom. I figured she left her phone downstairs and was caring for a patient. And then I got a call from her. She frantically whispered into the phone, "Melissa, he found out that I'm leaving. I need to leave now." And I was offering to come and get her, but she didn't want to put me in danger. And then she said, "Oh no, he's back. I've got to go." And she hung up.
Frederick County 911.
Ma'am, could you send an ambulance and a police car to 215 Stafford Drive? There's been a shooting.
215 Stafford Drive.
Yes, ma'am.
Who's been shot?
Me and my wife got in a terrible argument. I caught her in an affair, and I just shot her, and I swear to God I didn't mean to do that.
Where is she right now?
laying in the bathtub. What I'm going to do is this. I've got to put my belt on, the rest of my clothes on, and put my shoes and socks on, and be out front. I'm going to have my hands in the air, tell the officers.
Yeah, I understand. Is she awake?
Yeah, she's a gurgling in there. She's breathing. If the ambulance gets here quick, she might be phased.
Okay, are you... Okay, where's the gun?
I have laid it on the floor. I'm going to be waiting for the police out front.
Okay.
Thank you.
I received a call from my lieutenant. He advised that a female was shot by her husband. Deputies responded to the scene. Mr. Heflin was detained without any issues. They located Mrs. Heflin in a bathtub. She sustained a gunshot wound. She was taken to the Winchester Medical Center, and then from there, they flew her to Inova Hospital.
I was scrolling on the local radio chatter page, 200 block Stafford Drive, man shoots wife. I was dizzy and shaking uncontrollably. I remember running through the hospital and I was just so relieved that she was alive. And it didn't really matter anything else.
Oh my God, he did it. First time in my life, I literally dropped to my knees. And I stood at the end of her bed, and I looked at her, and I knew that she had endured something that no human being should endure. They had to remove her eye. It was beyond repair. They had a procedure the very next morning to try to connect a vein in her arm because it took the brunt of the shotgun blast. Her arm actually saved her life.
She survived so much. There was multiple surgeries on her brain. And she actually started doing a little bit better. So we got very hopeful.
Within 2 or 3 days, I could tell that she knew I was there, and she knew that Melissa was there. She didn't know where she was, but she knew that we were there.
Mr. Heflin, I'm behind you. I don't want to startle you. How are you?
I'm better.
We were conducting an interview with Mr. Heflin at the Frederick County Sheriff's Office.
We run a small nursing home. She had to go upstairs, so I see her phone laying there. God must have made me pick that phone up. I picked the phone up, and there was some man on there she was talking to.
He was on the other end of the phone?
He was texting.
Texting, okay.
Well, what happened was, after I found him on there, I got really mad about it. I said, look, I thought we had things straightened out. Then she came up and told me she'd had multiple affairs. When she went 3 years ago to stay with my daughter, she took a man down there with her. Well, she point blank hit me with all this, and it just broke my heart off. Broke my heart.
He was putting it all on her. All the problems in their relationship was because of her. It was about everything that she did wrong.
Well, my heart's been breaking all day. She should have just left. But no, she wanted to stay a month until her boyfriend could get a house for him down in Florida. Well, we got a fight because she's on the phone with him again. She knew that she's going to be on the phone with him. That's going to upset me, you know. I grabbed the phone and she was calling baby and all that stuff. Officer, I went crazy.
So tell me what happened after you lost your cool.
Well, I grabbed the phone from her. She grabbed me around the arm and started twisting my arm. And I started going crazy. I mean, went nuts.
What was she doing?
She tore all of her Christmas present boxes up and destroyed everything and went just completely ape. Oh, yeah.
You grabbed the phone and she went into the bathroom.
Right, that's exactly how it happened. She went in the bathroom, pissed off, crying. And I got the shotgun shot through the door. I don't know what possessed me. I'll just shoot through the door now to scare her and she'll straighten up. What was I thinking about? You just go wild and crazy in your mind. I'm sure both of you all have had days where things go nuts and you have trouble controlling yourself.
Everybody, yeah.
I think he was trying to figure out his way of saying he just lost it and it just happened. He was taken to the magistrate and charged with aggravated malicious wounding that night.
The nurses were hopeful, so that gave us hope.
She came out of intensive care because she was doing so well, but the damage with the buckshot in the brain started to bleed.
She got this look on her face, like she was very concerned. I said, "Mom, are you okay?" She said, "Yeah." And then she had a grand mal seizure.
And I remember looking at the head nurse, and her eyes told me what I already knew, that my sister was gone.
At that point, we knew we had a murder investigation.
Oh, believe me, I really didn't mean to do this.
We knew already some of what the defendant was going to testify in his defense.
I pointed the gun at the bathroom door in a rage. The gun went off and it hit her in the head.
She knew that she's going to be on the phone with you, and that's going to upset me. I'm sure both of you all have had days where things go nuts and you have trouble controlling yourself.
Everybody, yeah.
That is a classic hot blood defense. He was hoping to reduce his exposure from potentially life in prison for first degree all the way down to 10 years in prison for the manslaughter. And we felt very strongly that that would not be justice. First degree murder was the natural charge in this case. We owed that to the victim, to get justice for our victim. First-degree murder requires premeditation and deliberation, but it doesn't require deliberation for any particular period of time. It can be very quick. You can deliberate in the time it takes to grab a knife and go after someone.
When we reenacted it, it took us approximately 15 seconds to get into the gun safe. And then another several seconds to load the gun and walk to the door of the bathroom. So you're looking at between 25 to 30 seconds before he shot the gun.
That's all time that he could have thought, you know, this is a really bad idea. And that's a lot of premeditation, legally speaking. The timeline of this case, it was an all-day event. There was a great deal of video camera footage within the home during the course of the day. And we could see them moving back and forth throughout the house throughout the day. It had started early in the day. They had argued earlier in the day. And she had had communications with this other gentleman, and he was trying to monitor anything that she was doing on her phone, any chance that he had to get a look at her phone so he could determine whether or not she was texting with this person. He had been focused in on this and riling himself up about this all day long.
Mr. Heflin never gave Miss Heflin any space. It's almost like he kept pushing instead of just separating himself from the situation. He continues to make contact with Miss Heflin. He could have just left her alone.
There was some fantastic work done by our investigators. Investigator Schwartz and the others on the team know that we are going to want to see some ballistics. We're going to want to see the trajectory. That's going to be very important in this case. We know that. The investigators load the buckshot holes with dowel so that we can see the general angle of fire. And we see that it is basically straight through the door, a little bit right to left, and a little bit of a downward angle. Just a little bit. And that's critical in this case. If you think about shotgun ammunition, the cartridges all look the same. It's what's inside that plastic cylinder that's important. Mr. Heflin purposely loaded double-aught buckshot in that shotgun. Double-aught buckshot is a larger size ball, where there's only like 8 or 9 of those balls in there. You're dealing with a very large projectile coming out at an extremely high speed with great force and impact, especially at close range. If you know that your wife is holding that door and you are going to fire through it, you know you're going to strike her. The use of those dowels through the hole showing the trajectory was brilliant police work to show us what his real intent was. We were ready to go to trial. We had more than sufficient evidence to obtain a conviction. We were very confident. But there is always risk. You can never be absolutely certain that a jury will determine your way. And you end up either not getting a conviction at all, or you get manslaughter. His lawyers came to us asking if there was any kind of a plea agreement we could reach, first-degree murder being 20 to life, where the defendant might have some hope of seeing the outside world and not dying in prison. And that's what basically gave us the opportunity to take manslaughter off the table, take first-degree life off the table, just focus on second degree. We know we're dealing with anywhere from 5 to 40 years in prison. So we took that to the family and discussed it with them.
When I heard about the plea deal, I was so angry. He deserved the worst that he could possibly get. This was so cruel. This was evil. But it just kind of made sense, because they said he's going to go away for a long time, and this just ensures that he doesn't walk. I just had to trust them, that they knew what they were doing.
Within the plea deal, he could not appeal the sentence. And so that was a little bit more acceptable.
We decided that we would treat the sentencing hearing like a mini trial of the case.
Yeah, she's a gurgling in there. She's breathing. If the ambulance gets here quick, she might be saved.
We played the 911 tape. We played snippets of his interviews. We did those things just to show that the fact that he'd murdered his wife didn't seem to really affect him emotionally at all.
And I got the shotgun shot through the door.
He was callous, premeditated, and just came after her with the intent to kill her.
It was a good verdict. It was a good sentence. And he's going to be in there for a long time before he's even eligible for parole.
While I would have loved to see him get the electric chair or a lethal injection or never get out of prison again, I think he got the best that they were able to give us.
If there's any lesson to be learned from this tragedy, Jenny made a blueprint of what road not to go down, and a warning to anyone out there to believe that they are in danger and to escape from that danger and to be able to live their life in freedom. Jenny had signed to be a donor, organ donor, And even in Jenny's death, she still gave life. And 5 people live today because of her. So throughout Jenny's life, she gave and gave and gave. But I know she's at peace now. She's no longer bullied. She is no longer lorded over and told what to do. And I will forever be proud of her for making that decision to finally break free.
They say some lives end in a single violent moment, a flash of chaos that splits time into before and after. But there are other stories where the ending doesn't arrive suddenly at all. It builds. Quietly. Patiently. Like something that has been standing in the dark for years, waiting to be invited in. On a cool November morning in Charleston, South Carolina, the world inside a quiet house on Trad Street looked almost ordinary. The kind of ordinary that never announces itself as fragile until it is already broken. The kind of morning where sunlight spills across polished wood floors, where routines are followed without hesitation, where a woman who has built her life on discipline and care prepares to step into another day of teaching, unaware that the day has already been taken from her. Inside that house, Mary Lynn Witherspoon moved through her morning with the precision those who knew her would later remember so clearly. She was not someone who ran late. Not someone who forgot details. Her life was built on structure, on the belief that order could keep chaos at bay. There was comfort in her routines, in the way she prepared for work, in the way she made sure everything was in its place before she left. For her students, she was a steady presence. For her colleagues, she was dependable in a way that felt almost unshakable. But outside that structure, something had been circling for years. Something that did not respect order. Something that did not need permission. It had learned her patterns long before that morning. It had memorized her habits the way one might memorize a map, not to admire it, but to move through it unseen. It had watched her long enough to understand when she would leave, when she would return, when she would feel safe enough to believe she was alone. And on that morning, it did not knock. It entered. What happened inside those walls would later be reconstructed through evidence, through testimony, through the fragments left behind in a space that once held a life. But in the moment itself, there were no witnesses. Only interruption. Only force. Only the sudden collapse of safety in a place that should have been the most protected space in the world. By the time anyone outside realized something was wrong, Mary Lynn Witherspoon had already disappeared from the rhythm of her day. At school, there was confusion at first. A small, almost dismissible absence. The kind that might be explained by traffic, by illness, by something temporary. But that explanation never came. Minutes stretched. Then hours. And slowly, unease began to settle in where certainty used to be. People who knew her began to call. Not because they feared immediately, but because they knew her consistency. Her predictability. Her refusal to be late. It was not fear that came first. It was disbelief. A quiet resistance to the idea that something could interrupt someone like her. When calls went unanswered, that disbelief began to change shape. It became concern. And concern, in cases like this, is often the first honest signal that something has already gone too far. At the same time, somewhere not far from that quiet house, the history of another life was already tightening into place. A history that stretched back decades. A history that did not begin with violence, but with attention. With proximity. With a gaze that lingered too long and learned too much. Edmonds Tennant Brown IV had not always been a name connected to tragedy. At one point, he had simply been a presence near a life he was not supposed to define. The connection between him and Mary Lynn Witherspoon was not built on chance. It was built through family proximity, through the relationship between his father and her, through years in which boundaries should have formed naturally, but instead dissolved into something far more complicated. What began as observation, as a teenager watching an adult from the edges of his world, did not fade with time. It evolved. It hardened. It became something that did not behave like ordinary attraction or ordinary resentment. It became fixation. The kind of fixation that does not ask permission to exist and does not accept absence as final. Over the years, that fixation learned how to survive. It learned how to return. Long after childhood ended, long after the initial circumstances had changed, it remained. Watching. Waiting. Moving closer when it could. Retreating when it had to. Returning again when the world stopped paying attention. Mary Lynn's life, on the surface, continued with professionalism and grace. She taught. She mentored. She lived in a house that reflected her personality, organized, intentional, carefully maintained. But beneath that surface, something else had been taking shape for more than 20 years. There were moments when she felt it without being able to fully explain it. The sense of being observed. The subtle violations that did not always leave clear evidence, but left emotional residue. A missing item. A shifted object. A feeling that something had crossed a line while she was not looking. At first, these moments could be dismissed individually. Life is full of small uncertainties. But over time, the pattern became harder to ignore. The presence became harder to rationalize away. And eventually, it became undeniable. She reported it. More than once. She sought help. She documented what she could. She tried to build barriers, both physical and procedural. Locks. Alarms. Calls. Contacts. Systems of protection that were meant to create distance between her and whatever kept finding its way back into her life. But protection is only as strong as the systems that uphold it. And systems, like people, can fail. What made this case different from so many others was not just the persistence of the intrusion, but the way it blurred the boundary between fear and familiarity. This was not a stranger in the traditional sense. This was someone who had been present at the edges of her life for so long that his presence had become a kind of shadow. Not always visible. Not always provable. But always there. And shadows are difficult to prosecute. They do not leave fingerprints in obvious places. They do not always arrive in time for intervention. In the summer of 2003, the pattern escalated into something that could no longer be dismissed. An intrusion that finally crossed a legal threshold. An act that resulted in arrest. For a brief moment, there was relief. A sense that the long, exhausting cycle might finally be interrupted. That the system, imperfect as it was, had finally done enough to create separation. Mary Lynn Witherspoon believed, as many would in her position, that this was the turning point. That the danger had been contained. That the weight she had been carrying for decades might finally lift. She began to imagine safety not as a temporary state, but as something returning to her life. She even registered for notification systems designed to alert victims if circumstances changed. A measure intended to restore control, to ensure that she would not be caught unaware again. It was a small act of reclaiming agency in a situation that had stolen so much of it. But systems built to protect are still operated by people. And people make mistakes. Information was miscommunicated. Records were unclear. Notifications that should have reached her did not arrive in the way they were intended. In the fragile space between policy and execution, an error took shape. A gap formed. And through that gap, something slipped. Not immediately. Not visibly. But enough. Enough to change everything that would follow. On the morning of November 14, 2003, the house on Trad Street was quiet in the way homes often are just before tragedy arrives. Not ominous. Not cinematic. Just ordinary. A woman preparing for work. A life continuing its routine. A world that had no reason yet to anticipate rupture. And somewhere beyond that quiet, something that had spent years learning patience finally reached the moment it had been moving toward without ever announcing its intention. What happened next would later be described in legal terms, in investigative summaries, in court documents that attempt to compress violence into language that feels controlled. But in reality, it was not controlled. It was not orderly. It was the collapse of boundaries that had been tested for decades. When Mary Lynn did not arrive at school that day, it was not immediately interpreted as catastrophe. At first, it was confusion. Then concern. Then the slow realization that something deeply wrong had interrupted a life that was known for never breaking routine. Calls were made. Voices changed tone. People began to move with urgency they did not fully understand yet. And as the morning progressed, the absence stopped being an absence and started becoming a question no one wanted to answer too quickly. Inside the house, the silence remained. The kind of silence that does not feel empty until it is compared to what should be there. By the time anyone crossed the threshold, the story had already ended in the only way it could have, given everything that came before it. They say Charleston is a city that remembers. Not loudly, not like places built on spectacle or chaos, but in the way old houses seem to absorb the lives lived inside them. Brick walls that hold warmth long after the sun is gone. Streets that carry footsteps from generations past. And houses on quiet streets like Trad Street, where the paint may change, the owners may change, but something about the silence inside never fully forgets what it has witnessed. Before the violence, before the headlines, before the name Edmonds Tennant Brown 4 became tied to tragedy, there was a city that simply contained two lives moving on different trajectories without any visible reason for their paths to collide again. Mary Lynn Witherspoon lived her life with the kind of discipline that made her feel almost anchored to time itself. People who knew her often described her mornings as predictable in the best possible way, as if she had made an agreement with the world that chaos would stay outside her door. She taught French with patience that came not from ease, but from effort. She worked with children who were already carrying burdens far too heavy for their age, and she treated them as if structure and kindness could offer them something stable in return. Her world was not large, but it was carefully constructed. There was comfort in that construction. Every object in her home seemed to have a place. Every habit had a purpose. Even the way she walked through her house carried a rhythm that suggested order was not just a preference, but a form of protection. But order is not the same as safety. And sometimes, what exists outside the structure learns how to move through it anyway. Edmonds Tennant Brown 4 did not enter Mary Lynn's life as an unknown force. That is what made everything more complicated, and in a way, more unsettling. He had a history that overlapped with hers in a way that was never fully innocent, never fully defined, and never fully resolved. His father's connection to her in the early 1980s had created an unintended proximity, a social overlap that placed him in her orbit during his adolescence. At that age, perception is still forming, identity still unstable, and emotional boundaries still porous. What began as observation became fixation. Not in a sudden rupture, but in a slow accumulation of attention that never fully dissipated. Years passed, and while the world around him changed, that fixation did not dissolve. It adapted. It learned patience. It learned silence. It learned how to exist without drawing attention until it was ready to act again. For Mary Lynn, the early signs were not immediately understood as part of a single pattern. At first, they appeared as isolated disruptions in the rhythm of her life. Things that felt slightly off. The kind of moments that are easy to dismiss individually, because the mind resists assembling them into something more threatening. A sense of being observed that arrived and left without proof. A missing item that could be rationalized away. A door that seemed not quite as she left it. But the human mind is built to seek stability, and stability often comes in the form of explanation. So she did what most people would do. She explained. She adjusted. She continued. Until explanation stopped being enough. The presence that surrounded her life did not behave like ordinary intrusion. It did not move with the logic of opportunistic crime or random threat. It returned too often. It followed patterns that suggested knowledge rather than chance. And over time, that knowledge became undeniable. Someone was learning her life from the inside out. The violation deepened not through single dramatic moments, but through repetition. Repeated entries into her private space. Repeated disruptions of her belongings. Repeated confirmation that her boundaries were no longer fully intact. The items taken were never those of high monetary value. There was no interest in wealth, no evidence of conventional theft. What disappeared were things tied directly to her personal presence. Clothing. Personal effects. Objects that carried trace familiarity. It was not extraction for gain. It was possession through proximity. Each intrusion carried an emotional weight that accumulated slowly, like water filling a space that cannot be sealed. Fear does not always arrive as panic. Sometimes it arrives as fatigue. The exhaustion of realizing that safety requires constant vigilance. The realization that vigilance itself is not always enough. Mary Lynn adapted in ways that showed both resilience and resignation. She installed protective systems. She kept tools for personal defense within reach. She learned the names of officers she could contact quickly, as if familiarity with authority could shorten the distance between danger and response. Her life became a balance between maintaining normalcy and preparing for interruption. Yet even with all of that, there was always a question that remained unresolved. How do you protect yourself from something that already knows how you live? The system around her did respond, but not always in ways that matched the urgency of her experience. Reports were filed. Incidents were noted. Interventions occurred. But each cycle seemed to reset rather than resolve. Consequences were inconsistent. Boundaries were tested repeatedly, and each time they held just long enough to create the illusion that they might hold permanently. That illusion is often the most dangerous part. Because it creates hope at the exact moment when caution is still required. In the summer of 2003, the pattern escalated into something that could no longer be interpreted as isolated incidents. An intrusion led to an arrest, and for the first time in years, there was a visible break in the cycle. The physical presence that had shadowed her life was finally contained within the structure of the legal system. For Mary Lynn, that moment carried a complex emotional weight. Relief, certainly, but also disbelief. When a threat has defined your sense of safety for so long, its removal does not immediately translate into peace. The absence of danger can feel unfamiliar, even unreal, as if the mind is waiting for the return of something it has learned to anticipate. Still, she tried to move forward. She took steps that suggested trust in the system's ability to hold what it had finally taken into custody. She registered for notification services designed to inform her of any change in status. She built her life forward cautiously, as if walking on ground that might still be unstable beneath the surface. But systems are not singular entities. They are networks of people, processes, and technologies. And within those networks, communication can fail in ways that are not immediately visible to those who depend on them most. Somewhere in that structure, information did not align correctly. A change in status was not conveyed with the clarity or urgency it required. A notification intended to reinforce awareness instead created confusion. A message that should have strengthened protection instead weakened it by omission and error. Mary Lynn believed she understood the situation as stable. That belief, though understandable, was not fully aligned with reality. And in cases like this, perception is not a safeguard. It is a vulnerability. As autumn approached, Charleston moved through its seasonal rhythm. The air grew slightly cooler. The light shifted in the mornings. The city continued its quiet persistence, unaware of how close one of its private lives was to another rupture. Inside her home, Mary Lynn continued her routines. Teaching. Preparing lessons. Maintaining the structure that had always grounded her. Yet even in moments of routine, there are subtle signs that something is wrong. A tension that does not belong. A silence that feels slightly misaligned. A sense, difficult to articulate, that the world is holding its breath. On November 14, 2003, that breath was released in the worst possible way. But long before that moment arrived, the conditions that allowed it had already been set in motion. The combination of prolonged fixation, repeated boundary violations, inconsistent enforcement, and critical informational failure created a space where vulnerability could not fully close. And within that space, something that had learned patience over decades finally reached its endpoint. The morning itself began like many others. There was no visible disruption at first. No external signal that anything had changed. A life moving through familiar motions. A house holding its quiet structure. A city beginning its day. But underneath that surface, the long accumulation of attention, obsession, and systemic failure was already converging toward a single point. What followed would later be reconstructed in detail, but reconstruction always arrives too late to change what it describes. The moment itself had already passed through the world, leaving only traces behind. And those traces would eventually lead investigators, family members, and an entire community toward an understanding that safety is not only a matter of distance or intention. It is also a matter of whether warning, when it arrives, is received in time to matter. Mary Lynn Witherspoon was the kind of person who left impressions not through volume or spectacle, but through consistency. In a world that often rewarded noise, she moved with quiet precision, the kind that made people trust her without needing to explain why. Her life did not feel designed for attention. It felt designed for stability. And perhaps that was why, when instability finally entered it, the contrast was so devastatingly clear. To her students at Charlestown Academy, she was more than a French teacher. She was a steady hand in a classroom where many young people were still learning how to steady themselves. She corrected mistakes gently, never humiliating, never raising her voice in anger. There was a rhythm to her teaching that mirrored the rhythm of her life, structured, patient, deliberate. Even when a student struggled, she would wait. She believed, deeply, that understanding could be built over time, that confusion was not failure but a stage in learning. At MUSC, where she worked with children receiving medical care, that same patience took on a different shape. There, the stakes were more fragile. Children who were tired, frightened, or in pain responded not just to instruction, but to emotional presence. Mary Lynn understood this instinctively. She knew when to speak, and when to simply sit beside them. In those rooms, she was not just teaching language. She was offering something closer to normalcy, something that made the sterile environment of hospital corridors feel slightly less overwhelming. Outside of work, her life was defined by structure, but not rigidity. Friends described her home as warm, but ordered, a place where everything had its place and yet still felt welcoming. There was a comfort in her presence that extended beyond personality. It was in the way she listened fully when someone spoke. In the way she remembered details that others would forget. In the way she never made people feel rushed, even when time was limited. Yet beneath that composed exterior, there was a history of strain that few fully understood. It did not begin as trauma in the conventional sense. It began as something harder to define. A gradual erosion of safety that unfolded over years, so slowly that it could be mistaken for coincidence at first. Mary Lynn did not initially frame her experiences as part of a larger pattern. Like many people faced with subtle intrusions, she tried to interpret each incident on its own terms. A missing item could be misplacement. A strange feeling could be imagination. A moment of discomfort could be dismissed as stress. But patterns have a way of revealing themselves over time, especially when repetition becomes impossible to ignore. The first signs were not dramatic. They were almost invisible when viewed individually. A sense that something had been moved in her absence. A feeling of presence when she was alone. Objects that no longer seemed exactly as she remembered leaving them. At first, she questioned herself. Memory is not always reliable, and doubt often falls first on the person experiencing the unease rather than on the source of it. But doubt has limits. And when the same feeling returns too often, it begins to shift from uncertainty to recognition. It was not until later that the pattern became undeniable. Intrusions into her personal space that could not be explained away. Items missing that were clearly intentional in their selection. Personal belongings taken not for value, but for familiarity. Clothing. Small objects. Things that carried personal proximity rather than financial worth. The message, though unspoken, became increasingly clear over time. This was not about theft. It was about presence. About access. About crossing boundaries that were meant to remain intact. For Mary Lynn, the realization did not arrive as a single moment of clarity. It arrived as accumulation. A slow understanding that something outside her control had learned how to move within her life. That realization is often more destabilizing than sudden fear, because it forces a re-evaluation of what safety actually means. If your home is not fully yours, then where does safety exist? She began to adjust. Carefully at first, then more deliberately. Locks were checked repeatedly. Alarm systems were installed. She learned to look for small irregularities that might indicate intrusion. She developed a network of contacts she could reach quickly if needed, treating preparedness as a form of daily maintenance rather than occasional precaution. These actions were not born of paranoia, but of experience. Each step represented a negotiation between living normally and living cautiously. Yet even with these adjustments, there remained an underlying exhaustion. Constant vigilance carries a cost. It changes the way a person moves through their own life. Doors are checked twice. Sounds are interpreted more carefully. Silence itself becomes something to evaluate rather than simply exist within. Over time, the body learns to remain slightly tense, even in moments of apparent calm. What made her situation particularly complex was the identity of the person behind the intrusions. This was not a stranger in the conventional sense. It was someone whose connection to her life stretched back into earlier decades, tied indirectly through family association and proximity. Edmund's Tennant Brown IV had first entered her orbit during his adolescence, a time when perception and emotional development are still forming, still vulnerable to distortion. At that age, boundaries are not always fully understood, especially when proximity is normalized through social connection. What might have initially been an unremarkable presence gradually transformed into something else over time. Years passed, but the emotional imprint did not dissolve. Instead, it persisted in a way that became increasingly detached from reality, and increasingly anchored in internal narrative. For Mary Lynn, the significance of that connection was not immediately apparent in the early years. She did not initially interpret the situation through the lens of danger. Few people would. Most early warning signs, when viewed in isolation, do not clearly indicate long-term threat. They appear fragmented, too small to construct a full picture from. But the human mind is not always equipped to recognize escalation until escalation has already occurred. As the years progressed, the pattern surrounding Brown's behavior shifted from distant observation to repeated intrusion. The nature of these actions, as later understood, reflected not opportunistic intent but fixation. The difference between those two is critical. Opportunistic behavior seeks advantage. Fixation seeks connection, even when that connection is one-sided, distorted, or harmful. Mary Lynn's life became the target of that distorted connection in ways that were both invasive and persistent. The sense of being watched was no longer intermittent. It became recurring. The boundaries of her personal space were no longer fully respected. The psychological effect of this kind of sustained violation is difficult to articulate. It is not just fear. It is the gradual erosion of the assumption that one is alone when one should be. Despite these intrusions, she continued to function with remarkable professionalism. She taught, she worked, she maintained her responsibilities. This duality is often overlooked in discussions of prolonged stalking cases. From the outside, life can appear normal even while internal stability is under constant pressure. The ability to continue functioning does not necessarily indicate absence of fear. It often indicates adaptation to it. Over time, however, adaptation is not always sustainable. The escalation that eventually led to Brown's arrest in 2003 marked a turning point in the timeline of her experience. For the first time in years, there was a tangible interruption in the cycle. A moment where the legal system intervened in a visible, concrete way. The immediate emotional response to such a moment is often complex. Relief is present, but so is disbelief. After so long, absence of threat can feel unfamiliar, even suspect. Mary Lynn attempted to rebuild a sense of normalcy after that arrest. She engaged with available protective systems designed to notify her of any change in status. These systems are intended to restore agency, to provide reassurance that individuals at risk will not be left unaware. In theory, they function as a bridge between legal process and personal safety. But in practice, they depend on accuracy, timing, and communication integrity. And those elements did not align as they should have. Somewhere within the process, information was not correctly conveyed. A change that should have been clearly communicated became distorted in transmission. As a result, the understanding Mary Lynn had of her own safety did not match the reality of the situation developing outside her awareness. This misalignment did not immediately produce visible consequences. Instead, it created a silent gap. A space between perception and reality that would later prove critical. In hindsight, it is often easy to identify where systems failed. But in real time, those failures are fragmented, dispersed across processes that individually seem minor. A delayed update. A misdirected message. A procedural assumption that someone else has already taken responsibility. None of these appear catastrophic on their own. Together, however, they can shape outcomes in irreversible ways. Mary Lynn continued her life believing that the immediate danger had been contained. That belief was not irrational. It was based on the information she had been given. But it was incomplete. And in situations where incomplete information governs decisions about safety, vulnerability increases, without being visibly detected. This is the quiet tragedy of her story's setting. Not just the presence of long-term fixation, but the fragile infrastructure meant to contain it. A structure that, when functioning correctly, might have altered the outcome. And when it failed, even in small ways, created conditions in which that outcome became possible. Her life, viewed in this context, becomes not only a story of individual endurance, but also a reflection of systemic limitation. A reminder that safety is not a single act, but a chain of processes that must remain intact under pressure. And when even one link in that chain weakens, the consequences may not appear immediately. But they arrive nonetheless. The morning of November 14, 2003, did not begin with the sense of tragedy that hindsight would later impose upon it. It began like most mornings do in lives governed by routine, with small movements repeated so often they feel almost automatic. In Charleston, the air carried a slight coolness that hinted at the changing season, a subtle shift that residents might have noticed only briefly as they stepped outside, adjusting coats, preparing for work, thinking about the tasks ahead rather than the world behind them. Inside the house on Tradd Street, Mary Lynn Witherspoon moved through those familiar motions with the quiet efficiency that had defined her life. There was no indication that this morning would differ from any other. No visible disruption in the rhythm of her preparation. No signal that the structure she had built around her daily existence would be breached in a matter of moments. Her home, like her life, was orderly. Light filtered through windows in controlled angles, falling across surfaces that reflected care and attention. The environment did not feel chaotic or neglected. It felt lived in, but intentionally so, as if every object had been placed with consideration. For someone like Mary Lynn, this order was not just aesthetic. It was psychological. It represented control in a world where control had already been challenged in ways most people never experienced. On this morning, she prepared for work as she always did. Teaching was not just her profession, it was the structure around which much of her identity had formed. There was a sense of purpose in her routine, a continuity that connected one day to the next. She likely moved through familiar steps without hesitation, collecting what she needed, checking what she always checked, ensuring that everything was as it should be before stepping into the world beyond her door. But outside that sense of order, something else was moving. Not quickly. Not recklessly. But with a kind of patience that had been cultivated over years. This patience was not peaceful. It was anticipatory. It was shaped by familiarity with patterns, with observation, with time spent waiting for the right alignment of circumstances. The kind of patience that does not fade with delay, but deepens into expectation. Edmonds Tennant Brown IV had, by this point, existed in relation to Mary Lynn's life for more than 2 decades. That duration alone defies the way most people understand interpersonal conflict or obsession. It was not a brief escalation, not a sudden break from reality, but a prolonged fixation that had evolved through different phases of behavior, adapting to circumstance, withdrawing when necessary, returning when opportunity allowed. By November 2003, that pattern had already been established. There had been intrusions before. There had been interventions before. There had been moments where the system had engaged, and moments where it had failed to maintain continuity. Each cycle left behind traces, but no permanent resolution. And in the absence of resolution, repetition becomes possible. That morning, the repetition reached its most devastating form. The entry into the home was not announced. There was no warning that would have allowed distance to be created in time. The boundary between outside and inside, between safety and violation, was crossed in a way that left no space for negotiation. What followed occurred within the enclosed reality of the house itself, where sound, movement, and struggle were contained by walls that had once represented protection. Later reconstruction of events would rely on physical evidence, forensic analysis, and investigative interpretation. But those methods, while essential for understanding, can only approximate what occurred in lived time. They cannot fully recreate the psychological compression of those moments, the way time behaves differently when survival becomes immediate and everything else falls away. What is known is that violence entered the space with overwhelming force. Not random, not opportunistic in the conventional sense, but shaped by recognition. This was not an encounter between strangers. It was the collision of a long history of observation, and a life that had spent years attempting to remain intact despite that observation. Inside the house, the sequence of events unfolded rapidly. There was physical confrontation, a disruption of control, and a progression of actions that escalated beyond intrusion into irreversible harm. The nature of the violence suggested not confusion or improvisation, but familiarity with the environment, with the person, with the dynamics of resistance and control. In cases involving long-term fixation, the violence often carries a psychological dimension that extends beyond the physical act itself. It reflects not only an attempt to overpower, but an attempt to reassert a narrative that has existed internally for years. A narrative in which proximity is mistaken for connection and control is mistaken for resolution. Mary Lynn's final moments, as later understood through investigation, were shaped by this collapse of boundaries. The home, which had once been a space of order, became the site of its most complete disruption. Objects were displaced. Rooms were altered. The structure of the space no longer reflected its intended use, but instead reflected the intensity of what had occurred within it. When the violence ended, what remained was silence. Not the ordinary silence of a house before waking, but a silence that carries weight. A silence that feels different, because it is no longer part of routine. It is the absence left behind when presence has been forcibly removed. Outside the house, the world continued its morning rhythm unaware of what had just taken place inside. Streets filled gradually with movement. Schools began their day. Conversations started in ordinary tones. The city of Charleston, like any city on a weekday morning, did not immediately register that something irreversible had occurred within one of its quiet residences. At Charlestown Academy, the absence of Mary Lynn Witherspoon was initially perceived as unusual, but not immediately catastrophic. She was known for her punctuality. Her consistency made her absence noticeable, but not instantly explainable in terms of worst-case scenarios. People attempted to account for it through ordinary possibilities. Delay. Miscommunication. Unexpected obligation. These are the kinds of explanations the mind reaches for first, because they preserve normalcy. But as time passed and no explanation emerged, concern began to shift shape. It moved from casual uncertainty into something more defined. Calls were made. Messages were left. Attempts were repeated. Each unanswered effort added another layer to the growing sense that something was not aligning correctly. In situations like this, time becomes a form of evidence. The longer the absence continues without resolution, the less room remains for benign interpretation. Patterns of behavior that were once predictable begin to stand out in their disruption. A life defined by reliability makes deviation more visible. Eventually, those who knew her best began to act on instinct rather than assumption. The kind of instinct that is not based on proof, but on familiarity. They understood that this was not normal. Not for her. When authorities were contacted and the decision was made to check the residence, the atmosphere shifted once again. What had been uncertainty became investigation. What had been concern became procedure. The house on Tradd Street, once a private space, now became the focus of official attention. Approaching the home, there would have been no immediate external indication of what awaited inside. From the outside, it remained unchanged. A structure within a quiet neighborhood, indistinguishable at a glance from any other. This contrast between exterior normalcy and interior rupture is one of the most unsettling aspects of such cases. Violence does not always leave visible marks on the world outside its immediate location. Entry into the house revealed a different reality. The internal order that once defined the space had been disrupted. Rooms showed signs of struggle, of interruption, of movement that did not belong to the natural flow of the home. The environment no longer reflected daily life, but instead reflected the aftermath of something that had occurred quickly and with force. It was in the upper level of the house, in the bathroom, that Mary Lynn Witherspoon was found. The location itself carried a stark contrast. A space typically associated with privacy, with routine, with ordinary personal care, now held the final and irreversible evidence of what had taken place. The discovery marked the end of the search for her, but the beginning of a different kind of search. One focused not on locating a missing person, but on understanding how and why the breach had occurred, and who had been responsible for it. At that moment, the case transitioned from a missing person investigation into a homicide investigation, and the structure of inquiry shifted accordingly. Questions multiplied. Timelines were reconstructed. Relationships were examined. Prior incidents were re-evaluated in a new context, where patterns that had once seemed fragmented now formed a continuous line of behavior. And as investigators began to trace that line backward through time, the name Edmonds Tennant Brown IV would quickly emerge not as a possibility among many, but as a central figure in a long and escalating history that had been building far longer than the final morning that brought it to an end. The first officers who arrived at the house on Tradd Street would later describe a kind of silence that felt heavier than absence. Not empty, not peaceful, but saturated. A silence that seemed to press against the walls, as if the house itself was holding something it could not release. From the outside, nothing suggested the severity of what had already taken place inside. The structure remained intact, the street remained calm, and the neighborhood continued its ordinary rhythm. But once the threshold was crossed, the atmosphere changed in a way that was immediate and unavoidable. The entry was not rushed. There is a procedural caution in cases like this, a respect for uncertainty that shapes the way investigators move through space. But even careful movement cannot soften the reality that reveals itself in layers. First the signs of disruption, subtle at first, then increasingly clear. Objects not where they should be. Surfaces disturbed. The sense that the normal logic of the home had been interrupted by something that did not belong to it. As they moved further inside, the disruption became more pronounced. Rooms reflected the aftermath of a struggle that had not respected the boundaries of furniture or familiarity. The order that Mary Lynn Witherspoon had maintained in her life was no longer present in the physical arrangement of her home. It had been replaced by something disjointed, something that carried the imprint of urgency and force. In investigations of this nature, the physical environment often speaks in a language that is not immediately readable, but becomes clearer with attention. The positioning of items, the direction of disturbance, the contrast between untouched and affected areas all begin to form a narrative. Not a complete one, but a partial reconstruction of movement, resistance and progression. As officers ascended to the upper level of the house, the atmosphere shifted again. There is often a psychological threshold that accompanies certain spaces in crime scenes, particularly when the location narrows from general residence to specific rooms. The bathroom at the end of that sequence carried a stillness that was different from the rest of the house. It was not simply quiet. It was definitive. Inside that room, the search came to its end. The discovery of Mary Lynn Witherspoon transformed the nature of the scene entirely. What had been a search for explanation became confirmation of loss. From that moment forward, the investigation was no longer about possibility, but about cause, sequence, and responsibility. The emotional weight of that transition is difficult to quantify, even for those trained to process such scenes professionally. There is a shift from uncertainty to clarity, but it is a clarity that carries irreversible consequence. Outside the immediate space of the investigation, the ripple effects began almost instantly. News of the discovery moved through official channels, then into personal networks, then into the broader community. At Charlestown Academy, where she taught, the day that had begun with confusion turned into something far more difficult to comprehend. A missing teacher became a confirmed victim. The abstract fear that had been forming throughout the morning solidified into reality. For students and colleagues, the transition was not just informational. It was emotional and destabilizing. Mary Lynn was not a distant figure in their lives. She was a daily presence, someone whose consistency had shaped their expectations of routine. The sudden absence of that presence created a void that could not be immediately processed. People attempted to speak in practical terms, but emotion often interrupts practicality in moments like this. Conversations repeated themselves. Questions returned without answers. Silence filled the gaps between attempts to understand. Meanwhile, investigators began the process of reconstructing the timeline leading up to the discovery. This stage of an investigation is both technical and psychological. It requires attention to detail, but also an understanding of behavior, patterns, and relationships. The goal is not only to determine what happened, but to understand how the conditions for it were created. Early attention quickly turned toward individuals already known in connection to prior incidents involving Mary Lynn. Among them, Edmonds Tennant Brown IV emerged as a central figure of interest. This was not a sudden development. His name had appeared in earlier reports, in previous interactions with law enforcement, in the documented history of intrusions and disturbances that had marked Mary Lynn's life over many years. What made this case particularly significant was not just the presence of prior contact, but the duration and persistence of that contact. Over 2 decades of intermittent, but recurring behavior had created a pattern that could not be easily dismissed as isolated incidents. Each entry into her life, each reported violation, each documented concern contributed to a cumulative profile that investigators now had to examine in full. In reviewing that history, a clearer picture began to emerge. The behavior was not random. It followed recognizable patterns of escalation and withdrawal. Periods of absence were followed by reappearance. Minor intrusions preceded more serious ones. What initially might have appeared fragmented began to reveal a structure when viewed across time. One of the most significant challenges in cases involving long-term stalking behavior is the way in which individual incidents are often treated as separate events rather than parts of a continuum. When separated, each event can appear insufficient to warrant major intervention. When combined, however, they form a trajectory that is far more concerning. In Mary Lynn's case, that trajectory stretched back years. Reports of unauthorized entry into her home. Missing personal items that suggested targeted selection rather than random theft. Repeated attempts to locate or observe her despite changes in residence or routine. Each of these incidents, when viewed individually, could be categorized in different ways. Together, they formed a pattern that pointed toward sustained fixation. As investigators reviewed prior police interactions, they encountered a recurring theme of frustration. Enforcement actions had been taken, but consequences had not always produced lasting separation. Legal thresholds for continued detention or restriction were not always met in a way that prevented further contact. This created a cycle in which intervention occurred, but resolution did not. The system itself, when examined in hindsight, revealed structural limitations. It was not a single point of failure, but a series of smaller gaps that accumulated over time. Each gap allowed space for continuation. Each continuation reinforced the persistence of the behavior. And over years, that persistence became embedded in the timeline of Mary Lynn's life. At the same time, investigators had to be cautious not to assume conclusions before evidence was fully evaluated. Even when patterns appear strong, due process requires confirmation through physical, testimonial, and forensic evidence. This phase of the investigation involved detailed examination of the crime scene, collection of trace materials, and reconstruction of movements within the home. Forensic teams documented the condition of each room, noting disturbances, collecting samples, and establishing spatial relationships between affected areas. Every detail mattered, not because each detail was independently significant, but because together they contributed to a coherent understanding of what had occurred inside the house. As this process continued, attention increasingly centered on the connection between prior documented behavior and the events of November 14. Investigators examined timing, opportunity, and access. They reviewed previous instances in which Brown had been present near or inside Mary Lynn's property. They compared those instances with known changes in her routine, looking for overlap that could explain how familiarity with the environment had been established. What became increasingly clear was that the environment itself had been studied over time. Not in a single moment, but through repeated exposure. Familiarity with layout, routines, and patterns of movement suggested a level of prior observation that could not be ignored. In cases like this, familiarity becomes a critical factor, because it reduces uncertainty during execution and increases the likelihood of control. As the investigation progressed, the emotional weight of the case continued to spread through the community. For those who knew Mary Lynn personally, the details of the crime scene added layers of grief that were difficult to process. It was no longer only about loss. It was about the violation of a space that had once represented safety and stability. At Charlestown Academy, students and faculty began to gather not just in mourning, but in shared disbelief. The idea that someone so consistently present could suddenly be absent in such a permanent way challenged their understanding of continuity. Schools are environments built on routine, and when that routine is disrupted by tragedy, the impact extends beyond the individual to the structure of daily life itself. As investigators continued their work, one question increasingly guided the direction of inquiry. Not only what had happened, but how a pattern that had been visible for years had escalated to its final and irreversible point without being permanently interrupted. The answer to that question would not be found in a single document or a single decision. It would emerge through the accumulation of evidence, the reconstruction of history, and the careful examination of a relationship that had, over time, transformed from distant connection into prolonged and destructive fixation. By the time the investigation formally expanded beyond the initial crime scene response, Charleston was already under a kind of emotional pressure that does not show up in official reports. It existed in phone calls that ended too quickly, in conversations that repeated the same unanswered questions, in the uneasy silence of people trying to reconcile who Mary Lynn Witherspoon had been to them with the fact that she was now gone in a way that could not be reversed. For investigators, however, emotion had to be contained. The work that followed the discovery on Tradd Street was not shaped by grief in the immediate sense, but by structure. There were procedures to follow, timelines to construct, and a narrowing field of individuals who needed to be examined in relation to what had occurred inside that house. At first, the investigation moved outward. Standard protocol required them to consider every possible category of suspect. Burglary gone wrong. Random intrusion. Targeted attack by someone outside her known circle. Each theory had to be tested against the physical evidence gathered from the scene and the known facts of Mary Lynn's life. Her routine, her professional environment, her relationships, her recent interactions. Nothing could be assumed, even when early indicators pointed toward a familiar name. But even in those early hours, there was an unavoidable weight attached to one thread in particular. The history of prior stalking incidents. The repeated law enforcement contact involving Edmonds' tenant Brown 4. The documented pattern of intrusion stretching back years. It was not yet treated as conclusion, but it was impossible to ignore as context. Investigators began by reconstructing the most recent known sequence of events leading up to November 14. This involved speaking with colleagues at Charlestown Academy, reviewing her attendance patterns, confirming her last confirmed interactions, and mapping the timeline of her evening and morning routines. These steps are standard in any homicide investigation, but in cases involving long-term harassment, they take on additional significance. Routine becomes evidence. Predictability becomes a framework for opportunity analysis. What emerged quickly was a consistent picture of Mary Lynn's life in the days leading up to her death. There were no indications of sudden change. No disruption in her work schedule. No reported deviation from her established habits. This consistency, while reflecting stability, also provided a predictable structure that could be studied by someone familiar with her patterns. And there was someone who had demonstrated that familiarity repeatedly over time. As investigators reviewed past reports, they began assembling a chronological record of incidents involving Brown. This process revealed something critical. The case was not defined by a single escalation, but by accumulation. Each incident on its own had been addressed in isolation. A trespass here. A violation there. A period of absence followed by reappearance. But when placed together in sequence, they formed a pattern that was difficult to interpret as anything other than sustained fixation. One of the most challenging aspects of cases involving long-term stalking behavior is the way in which normalization occurs over time. When incidents are spaced apart, they can lose perceived urgency. Each event becomes its own isolated problem, handled and then closed. But closure in administrative terms does not always equate to cessation in behavioral terms. In Mary Lynn's case, closure was procedural. The behavior, however, continued in cycles that outlasted each intervention. As investigators dug deeper into the record, they found repeated points where Brown had been detained, questioned, or removed from proximity to Mary Lynn. Yet each time, the separation had not held permanently. Legal thresholds for extended restriction were not always met, or were not maintained in a way that prevented future contact. Over time, this created a pattern in which intervention occurred, but containment did not. This realization reframed the investigation. It was no longer just about identifying a suspect. It was about understanding a system in which repeated warning signs had not produced lasting separation between an individual and his target. At the same time, investigators began reviewing the most recent arrest in the summer of 2003. This incident stood out because it represented a clear escalation in behavior. It was no longer passive observation or minor intrusion. It involved direct contact with property and a level of exposure that resulted in formal detention. For a brief period, it appeared that the cycle had finally reached a point of interruption. Mary Lynn herself had responded to that arrest with cautious relief. She had taken steps to engage with protective systems designed to notify her of any changes in status. The intention of these systems was clear: to provide victims of stalking or prior violence with timely information that could prevent re-exposure to risk. In theory, they function as a critical bridge between incarceration status and personal safety awareness. But in practice, they rely entirely on accuracy and communication integrity across multiple layers of administration. And it was here that investigators encountered one of the most troubling aspects of the case. As they reviewed notification records, discrepancies began to appear. Information that should have been clearly transmitted had not been delivered in a consistent or accurate manner. In some instances, updates were delayed. In others, the status of Brown's custody was misrepresented in a way that created a false sense of security. These were not deliberate acts, but systemic failures in communication that had direct consequences. Mary Lynn had been led to believe, through official channels, that her situation was stable. That understanding influenced her perception of risk in the weeks leading up to November 14. From her perspective, the immediate threat had been contained. From the system's perspective, the reality was more complex and less stable than it appeared. This gap between perception and reality became one of the central points of investigative concern. It was not a single error that defined the failure, but a chain of small misalignments that collectively produced a misleading picture of safety. While this aspect of the case was being examined, attention remained focused on Brown's movements in the period following his release from detention. Investigators worked to establish a timeline of his location, his access to transportation, and his proximity to Mary Lynn's residence. This involved analyzing records, interviewing individuals who may have had contact with him, and reviewing surveillance or incidental sightings where available. What emerged reinforced the central concern already forming within the investigation. Brown's behavior did not appear random or opportunistic. It demonstrated familiarity with Mary Lynn's environment and routine. That familiarity suggested observation over time, not chance encounter. In cases of targeted intrusion, familiarity reduces uncertainty, and reduced uncertainty increases the likelihood of successful access. Investigators also examined prior incidents in which Brown had been linked to Mary Lynn's property or personal belongings. These incidents, when viewed in isolation, might have been interpreted as minor violations. But when analyzed collectively, they revealed a pattern of repeated boundary crossing. Entry into private space. Removal of personal items. Presence in areas associated with her daily life. Each instance contributed to a cumulative behavioral profile that increasingly pointed toward sustained fixation rather than isolated misconduct. As the investigative team consolidated this information, they also had to consider alternative explanations. This is a critical part of any homicide investigation. Even when a strong suspect emerges early, due process requires that other possibilities be examined and ruled out based on evidence, not assumption. However, in this case, alternative theories struggled to align with the physical and historical data. There was no indication of robbery as a primary motive. Items of value remained largely untouched. The disturbance within the home did not suggest financial targeting. Instead, the nature of the scene suggested personal engagement, familiarity, and escalation rooted in prior connection. As these conclusions began to take shape, investigators prepared for formal interviews and legal procedures involving Brown. The goal was no longer exploratory. It was evidentiary. Establishing timeline consistency, verifying access, and correlating behavioral history with physical evidence became the central focus. At the same time, the emotional reality of the case continued to affect those involved. Investigators are trained to manage distance, but cases involving prolonged victimization often challenge that distance. The duration of Mary Lynn's experience, the repeated failures of containment, and the ultimate outcome created a sense of weight that extended beyond procedural boundaries. For her colleagues, students, and family, the investigation represented not just a search for answers, but a confrontation with a long history that had not been fully visible from the outside. As details emerged, the scope of what she had endured over years became more apparent. What had once been understood as isolated incidents was now revealed as a continuous pattern of intrusion that had shaped her life in ways few had fully realized. By the time the investigative narrative reached a point of clarity, one conclusion had begun to form with increasing consistency. The events of November 14 were not an isolated act of violence disconnected from history. They were the culmination of a long trajectory of behavior, systemic gaps, and repeated failure to establish permanent separation. And as that trajectory came into focus, the investigation moved toward its next phase, where evidence would be presented not just to identify responsibility, but to establish the full scope of how a pattern spanning more than 2 decades had finally reached its irreversible conclusion. By the time investigators reached what would later be described internally as the breakthrough phase of the case, the emotional distance that had initially separated procedural work from human consequence had begun to erode. Not because procedure had changed, but because the weight of accumulated evidence no longer allowed the events to be viewed as isolated fragments. Everything was beginning to converge into a single, continuous line of behavior that stretched across decades. The house on Trad Street was no longer just a crime scene. It had become the fixed reference point around which every earlier event was being reorganized. Each report, each prior complaint, each documented intrusion involving Mary Lynn Witherspoon was being pulled backward in time toward that final morning. And at the center of that convergence was the same name that had appeared repeatedly in the margins of her life, Edmonds Tennant Brown IV. What made this stage of the investigation different was not a sudden discovery of a single piece of evidence that changed everything. It was the moment when scattered information stopped behaving like fragments and began behaving like structure. Patterns that had once been treated as coincidental or insufficient on their own were now reinforcing each other in ways that could no longer be ignored. Investigators began by reconstructing the full timeline of Brown's known interactions with Mary Lynn, not just the most recent arrest, but every documented point of contact over the years. This included police reports, witness statements, prior restraining actions, and informal complaints that had never escalated into formal charges, but still formed part of the behavioral history. When placed in chronological order, the result was not a series of unrelated incidents, but a consistent trajectory of escalation interrupted by temporary pauses. Those pauses had once been interpreted as resolution. In hindsight, they were more accurately periods of withdrawal before re-engagement. The breakthrough did not come from a single dramatic revelation. It came from alignment. Different strands of evidence, previously held in separate investigative categories, began to intersect. Forensic findings from the house aligned with known behavioral patterns. Prior intrusion reports aligned with the physical familiarity demonstrated during the final incident. Even the timing of Brown's movements, after his release, began to align with known patterns of proximity behavior documented in earlier years. In homicide investigations involving long-term stalking dynamics, this moment of convergence is critical. It is when suspicion transitions into structured, evidentiary theory. Not yet legal conclusion, but no longer speculative uncertainty. One of the key elements that strengthened the case was the reconstruction of access. Investigators examined how someone with Brown's history would have been able to enter Mary Lynn's residence without immediate detection. This required a detailed understanding of both physical environment and behavioral familiarity. The evidence suggested that the perpetrator did not encounter the space as unfamiliar territory, but as a location already studied over time. This distinction mattered. It implied prior observation, repeated proximity, knowledge of entry points, routines, and vulnerabilities that could only have been acquired through sustained attention rather than chance. Parallel to this, forensic analysis of the crime scene began to reveal a more coherent sequence of movement. The distribution of disturbance within the home suggested a progression rather than random violence. Certain areas showed signs of confrontation, while others reflected controlled movement. This pattern was consistent with someone navigating a familiar environment while exerting dominance over a specific target within that space. As these findings accumulated, investigators revisited earlier incidents involving Brown, particularly those in which he had been detained or questioned in connection with Mary Lynn. What initially appeared as isolated enforcement actions now took on new significance. Each interaction represented not just a legal endpoint, but a point of contact within a larger behavioral continuum. The more the timeline expanded, the more difficult it became to separate individual events from the overarching pattern. What had once been treated as intermittent misconduct now appeared as sustained engagement over time. And within that sustained engagement, escalation was no longer an exception. It was the underlying structure. During this phase of the investigation, attention also turned to communication records surrounding the period immediately before and after Brown's detention in 2003. These records included notification systems intended to inform victims of changes in custody status. It was here that investigators encountered one of the most significant systemic failures in the case. The expectation was that Mary Lynn had been properly informed of Brown's release status or transfer. However, review of documentation revealed inconsistencies in how that information had been processed and delivered. In some instances, updates were delayed beyond their intended time frame. In others, the information provided did not accurately reflect the current legal status of the individual in question. For Mary Lynn, this meant that her understanding of her own safety conditions was based on incomplete or incorrect data. From her perspective, the immediate threat had been neutralized. From the system's perspective, the situation was far more unstable than she had been led to believe. This gap between perception and reality became a critical point of analysis. It did not directly cause the violence, but it influenced the environment in which vulnerability persisted without correction. In investigative terms, it represented a failure of communication integrity within a system designed to reduce risk. As investigators worked through these layers, they also began preparing the evidentiary structure that would support formal charges. This involved synthesizing physical evidence from the crime scene with historical behavioral data and legal documentation of prior incidents. The goal was not only to identify the perpetrator, but to establish continuity between past behavior and the final act. One of the most compelling aspects of this continuity was the consistency of targeting behavior. Across years of documented incidents, the focus remained singular. Mary Lynn was not one of many targets. She was the center of attention. This exclusivity is a defining feature in cases of long-term fixation. It reduces randomness and increases predictability, which in turn increases the ability to anticipate and follow patterns of behavior. Investigators also examined Brown's psychological profile, as it could be inferred from behavior rather than speculation. The evidence suggested a progression from observation to intrusion to possession-oriented actions. The repeated theft of personal items, particularly those with intimate or personal association rather than monetary value, indicated a focus on symbolic proximity rather than material gain. This type of behavior is significant because it reflects a desire to maintain psychological closeness to the target, even in their absence. It transforms physical objects into substitutes for presence. Over time, this reinforces fixation rather than diminishing it. As the case moved closer to formal resolution, pressure increased on both investigative and prosecutorial teams to ensure that every element of the case was documented with precision. Given the severity of the crime and the extended history leading up to it, there was an understanding that the case would not be evaluated solely on the final act, but on the entire pattern of behavior that preceded it. In parallel, the emotional impact of the investigation continued to expand outward. For Mary Lynn's family, colleagues, and students, the emerging details transformed grief into something more complex. It was no longer only about loss. It was about duration. The realization that what had ended in a single moment had actually been unfolding over years, largely unseen in its full scope. This realization is often one of the most difficult aspects for communities affected by long-term stalking cases. It reframes memory. It reinterprets past interactions. It forces a reconsideration of what was visible and what was not recognized at the time. As investigators prepared to move toward legal proceedings, they reached a point where the case could be articulated in a structured form. The convergence of forensic evidence, behavioral history, access analysis, and systemic communication failure created a cohesive narrative that no longer depended on isolated interpretation. What remained was to present that narrative in a way that could withstand legal scrutiny, while preserving the integrity of the evidence and the complexity of the case itself. At this stage, the investigation had moved beyond discovery. It had entered construction. The construction of a case that connected decades of behavior to a single morning in November, and in doing so, revealed how long-term fixation, when left insufficiently contained, can eventually converge into irreversible outcome. By the time the case against Edmonds Tennant Brown IV reached the courtroom phase, the story of Mary Lynn Witherspoon had already been transformed from a private tragedy into a public reckoning. What had begun as a quiet life on Tradd Street, shaped by routine and devotion to teaching, had now become the foundation of a legal narrative that stretched across decades of behavior, missed interventions, and one irreversible morning in November 2003. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere carried a different kind of tension than the investigation had. The investigative phase had been about reconstruction, about assembling fragments into coherence. The courtroom, however, demanded something else entirely. It required translation. Raw events had to be converted into legal language. Human behavior had to be expressed through statutes, definitions, and evidentiary standards. Emotion existed in the room, but it was not permitted to guide the structure of the proceedings. Brown sat at the center of that structure, as both subject and focal point of accusation. His presence was not marked by outward spectacle. There were no dramatic gestures, no visible outbursts. Instead, there was stillness. The kind of stillness that often appears in defendants facing overwhelming evidentiary weight, where the outward body becomes controlled while the internal reality remains inaccessible to those observing. The prosecution's case did not rely on a single moment. It relied on accumulation. From the very beginning of proceedings, the narrative presented was not one of sudden violence, but of sustained behavioral trajectory. The argument was built on the idea that the events of November 14, 2003 were not isolated, but the predictable endpoint of a pattern that had been documented over more than 20 years. Evidence was introduced in layers. First came the crime scene reconstruction, presented not as emotional description, but a structured analysis. The physical layout of the house, the disturbances within it, the sequence of movement inferred from forensic examination. Each detail was positioned to establish not just what had happened, but how familiarity with the environment had influenced the progression of events. Then came the historical record. Prior incidents involving Brown and Mary Lynn were introduced with careful chronological framing. Each report, each documented intrusion, each prior law enforcement interaction was presented as part of a continuous timeline rather than isolated episodes. The prosecution's objective was to eliminate the possibility of viewing any single event in isolation. The focus was on continuity. As testimony unfolded, witnesses described Mary Lynn not only as she was in the final phase of her life, but as she had been over time. Her colleagues spoke of her consistency, her reliability, her absence of unpredictability in daily routine. This testimony was not incidental. It served a structural purpose in the case. Predictability, in this context, became relevant to understanding how someone could study and anticipate behavior over long periods. Law enforcement officers, who had previously responded to incidents involving Brown, also provided testimony. Their accounts highlighted a recurring challenge in the case: the difficulty of translating repeated, but individually limited incidents into sustained legal intervention. Each encounter, taken alone, often met thresholds for short-term action, but not always for long-term containment. Over time, this created a cycle in which intervention occurred without permanent resolution. The courtroom presentation of this pattern was deliberate. It was not framed as failure in emotional terms, but a systemic limitation in procedural terms. The distinction mattered because it allowed the jury to understand how a prolonged behavioral pattern could persist despite repeated contact with the justice system. One of the most impactful segments of the prosecution's case involved the introduction of communication records related to victim notification systems. These records illustrated how information regarding Brown's custody status had been processed and transmitted in the period surrounding his detention and subsequent transfer. The documentation revealed inconsistencies in timing and clarity that resulted in Mary Lynn operating under a belief that did not fully reflect the reality of her situation. This aspect of the case was particularly significant because it introduced the concept of informational vulnerability. Not physical vulnerability alone, but vulnerability created by incomplete or inaccurate understanding of risk status. In legal terms, this did not replace the act itself, but it provided context for the environment in which the final events occurred. The defense, in turn, faced the challenge of responding to a case built not on a single act, but on decades of cumulative behavior. Their strategy focused on questioning the interpretation of earlier incidents, attempting to separate documented interactions from the final outcome. The argument sought to emphasize the legal distinction between prior misconduct and the specific charges related to the homicide itself. However, the structure of the prosecution's presentation made strict separation increasingly difficult. Each prior incident, when viewed in isolation, might have appeared limited in scope. But when presented as part of a continuous timeline, the distinctions began to blur. The pattern itself became the central point of emphasis. Expert testimony introduced during the trial further reinforced this perspective. Specialists in behavioral analysis and investigative pattern recognition described how long-term fixation can manifest through repeated proximity-seeking behavior, boundary testing, and escalation over time. These explanations were not used to speculate on internal thought processes, but to contextualize observable actions documented in the record. As the trial progressed, attention increasingly centered on the relationship between access, opportunity, and familiarity. The prosecution argued that the nature of the final incident could not be understood without acknowledging prior exposure to Mary Lynn's environment. The argument was that familiarity reduces uncertainty, and reduced uncertainty increases the feasibility of controlled intrusion. Physical evidence from the crime scene was reintroduced with this framework in mind. Rather than being presented simply as forensic data, it was contextualized within a behavioral narrative. The positioning of disturbances, the nature of entry, and the internal movement through the home were all aligned with the concept of prior knowledge of space and routine. Throughout the proceedings, Brown remained largely passive in demeanor. His defense maintained procedural objections and legal argumentation, but there was no competing narrative offered that matched the scope of behavioral history presented by the prosecution. This absence itself became notable within the courtroom environment, where competing interpretations are often expected even in cases with strong evidentiary direction. As testimony continued, the emotional weight of the case became increasingly visible among those present, particularly among individuals connected to Mary Lynn. While the courtroom required restraint, the cumulative effect of hearing her life reconstructed through legal testimony created a quiet, but persistent emotional undercurrent. For the jury, the challenge was not only to evaluate guilt in relation to the final act, but to process the significance of a behavioral timeline that extended far beyond the immediate charges. The legal standard required focus on specific criteria, but human understanding inevitably extended beyond those boundaries. By the time closing arguments approached, the structure of the case had become firmly established. The prosecution presented the final synthesis of its argument, that the homicide was not an isolated act of violence, but the endpoint of sustained and escalating fixation, enabled by repeated boundary violations and compounded by systemic gaps in communication and containment. The defense reiterated its position, emphasizing the importance of distinguishing between historical behavior and the legal requirements for conviction on specific charges. However, the weight of the cumulative evidence had already shaped the interpretive framework within which the jury would deliberate. When the proceedings moved toward resolution, the courtroom carried a sense of finality that reflected not only the legal process itself, but the long trajectory of events that had led to that moment. The case had moved through its phases, from investigation, to reconstruction, to presentation, and finally to judgment. What remained was the formal articulation of responsibility within the boundaries of law. Brown ultimately accepted a plea arrangement, a decision that avoided the possibility of a death sentence, but resulted in life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the primary charge, along with additional concurrent sentences for related offenses. In the courtroom, the acceptance of this outcome marked the end of legal contestation. But it did not mark the end of the narrative that had brought the case into existence. That narrative, built over decades, now existed in a different form. Not as ongoing behavior, but as established record. As the proceedings concluded, attention shifted away from argument and toward consequence. The legal phase had reached its endpoint. What remained was the broader question of what the case represented in terms of systemic response, long-term victim protection, and the limits of intervention in cases of sustained behavioral fixation. And within that broader reflection, the story of Mary Lynn Witherspoon remained central, not as evidence, but as the life around which the entire legal process had ultimately been constructed. In the months and years after the courtroom fell silent, the case of Mary Lynn Witherspoon did not simply close. It settled into something more enduring, something that continued to move through legal discussions, training materials, and policy debates long after the individuals directly involved had left the immediate spotlight of the investigation. In Charleston, the house on Tradd Street remained physically unchanged, but its meaning within the community had permanently shifted. It was no longer just part of a historic street lined with preserved architecture. It had become a reference point in conversations about safety, warning systems, and the fragile boundary between awareness and prevention. For those who had known Mary Lynn personally, the aftermath was not a clean ending. It was a long continuation of absence. Her colleagues at Charlestown Academy returned to classrooms that still carried her influence in subtle ways. Lesson plans she had designed were still in use. Teaching methods she had refined continued to shape instruction. In this sense, her presence remained embedded in the structure of the institution, even as her physical absence was impossible to ignore. Students who had been taught by her carried memories that did not fade quickly, because they were tied not just to academic learning, but to the emotional stability she had provided in those learning environments. Grief in such cases rarely follows a linear path. It does not remain contained within a single moment of loss. Instead, it reappears in waves, often triggered by small and unexpected reminders. A phrase in French. A classroom discussion. A passing mention of routine or punctuality. These fragments can bring back the realization that someone who once anchored daily life is no longer present to continue doing so. For many, this was the most difficult part of the aftermath, the way ordinary moments became carriers of memory. Beyond personal grief, however, the case began to take on a broader significance. Legal professionals, policymakers, and victim advocacy groups started to examine what had occurred not only as an individual tragedy, but as a case study in systemic breakdown. The duration of the stalking behavior, the repeated law enforcement interactions, and the final failure of notification systems combined into a narrative that raised difficult questions about how long-term risk is managed when it does not fit neatly into short-term procedural categories. One of the most significant outcomes of this reflection was the development and passage of what became known as Mary Lynn's Law. This legislation was not framed as symbolic alone, although symbolism inevitably accompanied it. It was designed to address specific gaps that had been exposed by the case. At its core, the law focused on improving the reliability and accuracy of notification systems intended to inform victims of stalking and violent offenses about changes in offender custody status. The intention behind these systems is straightforward in principle. They are meant to provide individuals at risk with timely information so that they can take appropriate precautions. However, the effectiveness of such systems depends entirely on the integrity of data flow, administrative coordination, and consistent communication between agencies. In the case of Mary Lynn, breakdowns in this chain had created a false sense of security at a critical moment. Mary Lynn's law sought to reduce the likelihood of such failures by strengthening procedural requirements for notification accuracy and timeliness. It also emphasized the importance of accountability in maintaining updated records and ensuring that victims receive correct information in a form that is both accessible and actionable. In policy discussions, the law was often cited as an example of how individual cases, while tragic, can lead to structural change when examined with sufficient depth. However, even with legislative reform, there remained a deeper and more complex question that continued to surface in professional discussions. That question centered on the limits of systems themselves. No matter how well designed a notification process may be, it ultimately depends on human execution. Errors, delays, and miscommunications can still occur. The case highlighted the fact that safety systems are not static guarantees, but dynamic processes that require constant maintenance and oversight. In law enforcement training environments, the case began to be referenced in discussions about stalking behavior, escalation patterns, and the importance of recognizing long-term risk indicators. One of the key lessons drawn from the investigation was the danger of treating repeated low-level incidents as isolated events rather than potential components of a larger behavioral trajectory. When viewed individually, such incidents may not always meet thresholds for severe intervention. When viewed collectively, however, they can reveal a pattern that suggests sustained fixation and increasing risk over time. This shift in perspective was one of the most important conceptual changes that emerged from the case. It encouraged a more holistic approach to evaluating behavioral reports, particularly in situations involving repeated contact between the same individuals over extended periods. Rather than resetting evaluation after each incident, professionals began to place greater emphasis on cumulative history. For the community in Charleston, the passage of time gradually softened the immediate intensity of the event, but it did not erase its significance. The house on Trad Street remained a quiet reminder of what had occurred, even as life continued around it. People who walked past it might not always know the full history, but those who did carried a different awareness of how ordinary spaces can become the setting for extraordinary tragedy. For Mary Lynn's family, the aftermath was a process of adjustment that extended beyond legal resolution. Court proceedings had provided answers in a formal sense, but they could not restore what had been lost or reconstruct the lived continuity of her presence. What remained was memory, and the effort to preserve her identity beyond the circumstances of her death. In many cases like this, families find themselves navigating between public narrative and private remembrance, trying to ensure that the person is not reduced solely to the manner in which their life ended. Over time, conversations about Mary Lynn's case also began to intersect with broader discussions about stalking as a form of violence. One of the key challenges identified by advocates was the tendency for stalking behavior to be underestimated in its early stages. Because initial actions may appear minor or ambiguous, they are sometimes not treated with the urgency they require. Yet cases like this demonstrated how long-term fixation can escalate in ways that are not always predictable in their timing, but are often consistent in their direction. Another important aspect of the aftermath was the recognition of emotional labor carried by victims who repeatedly report incidents over time. Mary Lynn's history included multiple attempts to alert authorities to the pattern of intrusion she was experiencing. Each report represented an effort to seek protection within existing systems. The cumulative effect of these efforts, when viewed in hindsight, underscored the psychological burden placed on individuals who must continually justify their sense of danger in order to receive intervention. This realization contributed to ongoing efforts in some jurisdictions to improve how stalking reports are evaluated, with greater emphasis placed on pattern recognition rather than isolated thresholds. The goal of these changes is not to overextend intervention in every case, but to better identify situations where repetition itself becomes a critical indicator of escalating risk. Years after the legal proceedings concluded, the case continued to be referenced in academic and professional contexts. Criminology courses examined it as an example of long-term offender behavior and systemic interaction. Legal seminars discussed it in relation to victim notification law and procedural accountability. Advocacy organizations used it as a reference point in conversations about strengthening protections for individuals experiencing persistent harassment. Yet beyond these structured analyses, there remained a quieter, more human dimension that could not be fully captured in policy language or academic discussion. It was the recognition that Mary Lynn's life had been defined by more than the circumstances of its end. She had been a teacher, a mentor, and a stable presence in the lives of many students. She had contributed to the daily fabric of a community in ways that were not defined by crisis, but by consistency. In reflecting on her story, what remains most significant is not only what was lost, but what her life represented. A reminder that safety is often built through small, continuous acts of attention and care. A reminder that systems, while necessary, are only as strong as their ability to respond accurately to the realities they are designed to address. And a reminder that behind every case file, every legal proceeding, and every policy reform, there is always a human life that once existed in full complexity before becoming part of a public record. The aftermath of the case, therefore, is not a conclusion in the traditional sense. It is an ongoing process of interpretation, adjustment, and remembrance. The legal system reached its resolution. The investigation reached its endpoint. But the broader questions raised by what happened continue to persist in discussions about prevention, responsibility, and the limits of protection. And in that ongoing reflection, the story of Mary Lynn Witherspoon continues to hold its place, not as an isolated tragedy, but as a moment that reshaped how certain forms of danger are understood, identified, and addressed in the years that followed. In the years following the legal resolution of the case, the story of Mary Lynn Witherspoon continued to evolve in ways that extended beyond courtroom transcripts and policy reforms. It began to exist in a different kind of space, one shaped less by events themselves and more by interpretation, memory, and the gradual reframing of what had actually happened over the span of more than 2 decades. What had once been understood primarily as a single violent act was increasingly recognized as the endpoint of a much longer and more complex pattern of behavior, one that had unfolded in plain sight, but had never fully been seen in its totality until it was too late. For investigators who had worked the case, time created a certain distance, but not necessarily closure. Many of them continued to reflect on the structure of what they had uncovered. Not because there were unanswered questions about who was responsible, but because the case itself challenged assumptions about how risk is identified, how escalation is measured, and how long-term patterns of obsession are interpreted within systems designed to respond to individual incidents rather than extended trajectories. One of the most persistent reflections concerned the nature of visibility. When the early incidents in Mary Lynn's life were first reported, they were treated as discrete disruptions. A break-in, a missing item, a suspicious presence near a residence. Each event, on its own, appeared limited in scope. None of them, in isolation, clearly represented the full scale of what was developing underneath. And yet, when those same events were placed side by side years later, a different picture emerged entirely. Not fragmented, not ambiguous, but consistent, directional, and escalating. This retrospective clarity raised difficult questions among those who study behavioral escalation. How many signals must exist before a pattern becomes undeniable? How many repetitions are required before intervention shifts from reactive to preventive? And perhaps most importantly, how often systems fail not because they are absent, but because they interpret early signals as insufficiently connected to warrant sustained action. Mary Lynn's case became a reference point in these discussions, not because it was unique in the existence of stalking behavior, but because of its duration and the way it exposed the limitations of episodic response. The behavior directed toward her did not appear suddenly. It unfolded gradually, over years, in ways that often reset perception after each intervention. A system would respond, a case would be closed, and the underlying behavior would re-emerge later, slightly altered but fundamentally continuous. Over time, this created a cycle that was difficult to interrupt. Each individual response appeared appropriate within its own context, but the broader pattern remained unresolved. This is one of the most challenging aspects of long-term stalking cases. They do not always escalate in a linear or immediately visible way. Instead, they often move in waves, with periods of apparent inactivity followed by renewed intrusion. These gaps can create the illusion of resolution even when the underlying behavior has not fundamentally changed. In professional discussions that followed the case, this pattern became central to training on threat assessment. Analysts and investigators began to emphasize the importance of cumulative history over isolated evaluation. The idea was not to assume that every minor incident represented imminent danger, but to ensure that repeated contact between the same individuals over time was not treated as unrelated unless there was clear evidence to support that separation. Another area of reflection involved the psychological dimension of fixation-based behavior. Without speculating on internal thoughts beyond what could be inferred from actions, the case demonstrated how behavior can shift from observation to intrusion to possession-oriented conduct over time. The repeated targeting of personal spaces and belonging suggested an attempt to establish proximity that was not dependent on consent or mutual recognition. Instead, it was defined by unilateral persistence. This type of behavioral pattern is particularly difficult to disrupt because it does not rely on a single triggering event. It is sustained by repetition itself. Each act reinforces the connection in the mind of the offender, even when that connection is not reciprocated or acknowledged by the victim. Over time, this creates a distorted framework in which boundaries are repeatedly tested and gradually eroded. In Mary Lynn's case, that erosion occurred across many years, often in ways that were difficult to fully capture in real time. Reports existed, interventions occurred, but the overall structure of her experience remained one of recurring intrusion rather than permanent separation. This distinction became central to later reforms, particularly those focused on improving how stalking behavior is categorized and tracked across time. Beyond professional and policy discussions, there was also the quieter reality of how the case continued to exist in the lives of those who had known her personally. For them, the passage of time did not diminish the sense of absence. Instead, it transformed it. What had once been immediate grief gradually became long-term remembrance, shaped by the ongoing presence of memory in everyday life. In classrooms where she once taught, traces of her influence remained embedded in routine. Teaching materials she had developed were still in use. Methods she had refined continued to shape how lessons were delivered. For students who had passed through her classroom, memories of her presence often surfaced in unexpected moments, tied to language, structure, or even the quiet discipline she brought to learning environments. These memories did not carry the intensity of the immediate aftermath, but they remained persistent in a more subdued and lasting form. For her family, the years following the trial were shaped by a different kind of endurance. Legal proceedings had provided structure and clarity in terms of accountability, but they could not restore what had been lost. What remained was the task of integrating memory with absence, of preserving identity beyond the circumstances of death. In many cases like this, families are left navigating between public narrative and private understanding, ensuring that the person remembered is not reduced solely to the final chapter of their life. As time continued to pass, the case also became part of a broader cultural and institutional memory. It was cited in legal education, referenced in discussions about victim notification systems, and included in studies on long-term offender behavior. Each of these contexts emphasized different aspects of the case, but all returned in some form to the same central themes: the challenge of recognizing sustained risk, the importance of accurate communication systems, and the difficulty of maintaining protective separation over long periods when behavior does not conform to short-term expectations. One of the most enduring lessons drawn from the case was the importance of continuity in assessment. Risk does not always present itself as a single peak. More often, it develops through repetition. Each repeated contact, each repeated intrusion, each repeated violation of boundaries contributes to a cumulative understanding of threat that cannot be fully captured by isolated evaluation. This insight has influenced how certain agencies approach stalking cases, encouraging longer-term tracking rather than event-based closure. At the same time, the case also highlighted the limitations of systems designed to manage human behavior. Even when procedures are in place, they rely on accurate execution. Communication between agencies must remain consistent. Information must be transmitted correctly and in a timely manner. When these conditions fail, even partially, the resulting gaps can have significant consequences. Mary Lynn's case demonstrated how those gaps, when combined with long-term behavioral persistence, can create conditions where risk is not fully recognized at the moment it becomes most critical. Years later, when the case is revisited in academic or professional contexts, it is often framed not only as a story of individual tragedy, but as a case study in structural vulnerability. It is examined for what it reveals about the interaction between human behavior and institutional response, between pattern recognition and procedural limitation, between the lived experience of sustained fear and the administrative frameworks designed to address it. Yet beyond all of these analytical perspectives, there remains a simpler and more human reality at the center of the story. A teacher who lived with consistency and care. A life defined by dedication to others. A presence that shaped the experiences of students, colleagues, and family members in ways that extended far beyond the circumstances of her death. The years have not diminished the complexity of the case. If anything, they have expanded it. What began as a localized investigation has become part of a larger conversation about how societies recognize and respond to long-term patterns of harm. And within that conversation, the name Mary Lynn Witherspoon continues to appear not as a statistic or an abstract reference, but as a reminder of the human reality that exists behind every case file, every policy revision, and every attempt to understand how prolonged fixation can ultimately transform into irreversible consequence. In that ongoing reflection, the case remains open not in a legal sense, but in an interpretive one. It continues to inform how patterns are seen, how risks are evaluated, and how systems attempt to evolve in response to behaviors that unfold slowly over time, but end abruptly in moments that change everything.